Well, if we haven't met before, my name is Sean, and I have the honor of serving as teaching pastor here in our campus at the West Side. And I wanted you to think about an experience that I've had and that you've probably had. Has anyone ever said really nasty, negative things about you on the internet? Like whether I'm the only one. And I get it. Years ago, when we first lived in Houston, I had this blog and I was writing about stuff, and we were getting ready to leave to move away from Houston. Someone decided that would be their time to aggregate every nasty word or thought that anyone had ever said about me and just post it online. And they did it anonymously. And so it may not be your experience, but you don't have to look very far to see how mean people are. Like, if you've ever seen, I'm really bad about this. I will go on Instagram and there will be some video, and like I might break my neck running to the comment section because I know how mean people can be. And what's happened over the last 20 years is that all of us have become so addicted to this thing that we're on all of the time. And it's turned us into the worst versions of human beings. And you don't have to look very hard to find people online who are name calling, who are mocking. The internet, particularly the comment section, has just become this enemy creating machine that you can actually say something that you think is pretty innocuous and be met by everyone who could possibly disagree with anything that you've ever said. So in 2023, when I was taking some time for sabbatical, I decided that part of what I was gonna do that year was leave all social media. And it was a glorious time. And I don't really know why I've gone back, but during that same time, I decided to read Max Fisher's book called The Chaos Machine. And this is what Fisher says the chaos machine, the internet, does to us. He says, remember that the number of seconds in your day never changes. The amount of social media content competing for those seconds, however, doubles every year or so, depending on how you measure it. Imagine, for instance, that your network produces 200 posts a day, of which you will have time to read about 100. Because of the platform's tilt, you will see the most outraged half of your feed. Next year, when 200 doubles to 400, you will see the most outraged quarter. The year after that, the most outraged eighth. Over time, your impression of your own community becomes radically more moralizing, aggrandizing, and outraged. And so do you. At the same time, less innately engaging forms of content. Truth appeals to the greater good, appeals to tolerance, become more and more outmatched, like stars over Times Square. So this is what he's saying. Whatever you believe to be true about life, whether it's left, right, up, down, black, white, whatever your position is right now, in a few years, you will hold that position more radically than you do now. Not with more conviction, because convictions are things you have for yourself. You cannot have convictions for other people. That's not the way that conviction works. But you will be more radical about what you believe now in 4 years than you would be if you were just left alone. Social media, the internet, is an enemy creating machine. And I guess I was thinking about this and reading Hebrews 11. And if you've been around Ecclesia for the summer, you know that we've been in this series called Faithful and Brave. And we've looked at these heroes of the faith from Hebrews 11, these women and men who in their own time and in their own place had to walk the line, had to hold the tension of being faithful to God about who God was and what God had done, but also be brave about moving into the future. And there are lots of incredible stories packed in that one little chapter of the Bible about folks who face some of the same issues that we face, and oftentimes much greater tragedies than we face. And one of those is this man named David. And if you've been around the Bible, you have probably heard the name David. Like that's not something that would be new to you. His story takes up a huge chunk of the Old Testament. David is the youngest son of a man named Jesse, and a prophet named Samuel comes to Jesse looking for a new king because God is not pleased with Saul, who's the present king. And he tries out all of the sons, and God says no to all of those sons. But this youngest one, who is a shepherd boy, that's the one. So Samuel anoints David to be the next king. And you fast forward in his life, and you got stories like David and Goliath. And then David plays for King Saul. And Saul realizes that David is the next appointed king. So David spends a lot of his time on the run. And in his story, you have lots of triumphs in the life of David, but you really feel a lot of David running from people, hiding from people, going to war with people. Throughout his entire life, David has always had enemies. And so how would you and I hold the reality that we are constantly obsessed with this enemy-creating machine and live as people who treat our enemies as God would treat our enemies? And in addition to being a warrior and a king and a musician, David also wrote a lot of psalms. And one of the psalms we think David wrote is Psalm 23. Again, if you have not been around the Bible very much in your entire life, you know Psalm 23. Like if you had a praying grandmother at all, it was probably like in a crochet design on the wall or a pillow or something like that. And this is what David says in Psalm 23. He says, "The Eternal is my shepherd. He cares for me always. He provides me rest in rich green fields. Beside streams of refreshing water, he soothes my fears. He makes me whole again, steering me off worn, hard paths to roads where truth and righteousness echo his name. Even in the unending shadows of death's darkness, I am not overcome by fear, because you are with me in those dark moments. Near with your protection and guidance, I am comforted. You spread out a table before me, provisions in the midst of attack from my enemies. You care for all of my needs, anointing my head with soothing, fragrant oil, filling my cup again and again with your grace. Certainly, your faithful protection and loving provision will pursue me where I go, always, everywhere. I will always be with the Eternal in your house forever." And doesn't that sound lovely? When most of you learned this psalm, it probably sounded something like this: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And it just goes on to talk about all of these incredible things that you would want. Like, who wouldn't want God to lead them beside still waters? And who wouldn't want to not fear in your deepest valley? But there's one part of the psalm that I think is particularly important for our time and our age. It's right when you are basking in the glow of this beautiful psalm. David says, enemies. Enemies. And most of us don't like to think that we have enemies. Years ago, when Rochelle and I were living in Northern California, I was teaching a Wednesday night Bible class. We were talking about spiritual formation and spiritual formation practices. And one of the classic practices in terms of spiritual formation is that you can't deal well with your enemies if you don't know who your enemies are, or your perceived enemies, or people who think that you are their perceived enemies. So we were talking about praying for our enemies. And I said a good practice might be to make a list of your enemies. Well, I didn't come up with that on my own. People have been doing that for centuries. And the next week, one of our church members just livid at me and thought it was just so unchristian to make a list of your enemies, because Christians were supposed to not have enemies. And I wanted to be clear. This is a list of enemies that you perceive, or that you perceive they think you are their enemies. That's really different from having an enemies list. One of my favorite theologians, a woman named Barbara Brown Taylor, and she says Christians are really bad at fighting because we don't think that we should. And so what happens is that we go out and we face the world and we think, oh, I shouldn't have or acknowledge that I have enemies, so we do all kinds of other stuff. We become passive aggressive. We obfuscate. We manipulate. Or some of us do. Others of us love having enemies. About 2 years ago, there was an interview in the New Yorker with a talk show host who was growing in popularity. And they asked her how she went about kind of just funding the conversation on her talk show. How did she come up with it? And she goes, every morning, I wake up and look around the world and see what makes me angry. And that's what we talk about. And I thought, that sounds like a really good way to have a heart attack. Like, who wants to do that? But there are some of us that we are fueled by anger. We like having enemies. Matter of fact, some of us were taught that if we didn't have enemies, then we lacked faith and lacked conviction. And she was just talking about her political philosophy and feeling like she needed to have that anger. My friend Jonathan leads a church in Arkansas. And for years, he's had a Bible study every week with non-Christians who are just exploring faith. And he came across a guy about 5 years ago who was really interested, had been in the Bible study a long time. And his tradition, like one of the ways that you mark that is by believers' baptism. And so Jonathan was talking to him about becoming baptized. And the guy told him, I'd really like to be baptized, but I don't think I can. Because every day I wake up, and the thing that brings me the most joy every day is getting online to own the libs. And the way that you talk about Jesus, I wouldn't be able to do that anymore. And that's the way we have approached tension and enemies. We tend to deny that we have them, or we just pacify them, or we attack them. Deny, pacify, attack. But what if there was a completely other way? Because David, who has spent most of his life chasing down or being chased by real live enemies, not fake internet enemies, like I want to kill you enemies, and going to war on behalf of his nation, when he begins to sit down and talk about being restful and at peace with God and the world, this is part of what he says. The literal translation of Psalm 23:5 says this: you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And you should know that's the literal translation, because I translated it myself. And you don't need to know the literal translation. You just need to know that I can do that. Enemies. I also know a little bit about having enemies. When growing up, playing baseball, every other team that we went up against was somehow an enemy. And when you're young and dating, every rival for a guy or girl's attention is an enemy. In workplaces where people are being scaled back across numbers of different organizations and resources are scarce, anyone else who they might stay and you might go can be a perceived enemy. In our political sphere, people who don't agree with you today might be your enemy. We all have enemies. And there is a difference, both in intensity and kind, to a lot of those. But we all have them. And maybe I'm the only one that's like this. But when I'm in the midst of dealing with a perceived enemy, when I am faced with an enemy, I don't sleep well. I'm more angry than I want to be. I have actual physical, biological reactions to that. I don't want to talk to them, and I don't want to eat with them. But the psalm says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And there is a really thin way to read that I'm going to sit down and feast and make my enemies suck it. But that's not at all what David is talking about. Here's what I think the psalm means. That you don't have to deny or pacify or attack your enemies. That actually in the presence of your enemies, there is still an invitation to rest. Because the whole psalm is about finding rest and assurance in God's abundance and in God's goodness. And even when faced with enemies, you can rest. God never says that you and I won't have enemies. The psalm kind of assures us that we will. What the psalmist is saying is don't worry about it. It's really popular in our day and age to celebrate the destruction of our enemies. There are even Christian songs about celebrating the destruction of your enemies. But the psalm is reminding us that we don't need to seek out or keep any sort of enemies when we are secure in God's goodness. And that's why later the scriptures remind us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Dallas Willard talks about it this way. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Since I love my enemies, I would not feast upon a delicious meal in their presence and let them stand there hungry. The abundance of God's provision and safety in my life is so great, I would invite them to enjoy what God has prepared for me. And maybe for you or someone you know, is to know the difference between an enemy and an opponent. Like several friends of mine in the last couple of years have taken up jujitsu, and they will sometimes post their matches online. And you've seen it if you've ever watched even the Karate Kid, where there's this bow in these tournaments as opponents face one another. And even though you are about to fight, you bow to one another. And maybe that's just this gentle reminder that my opposition doesn't have to be my enemy. Because God thinks that we are going to sit at table together. And even in the presence of my enemy, there's a table. And I don't know that there's anything more Christian in the world than being at table. For God's own reasons, God believes that when we come to the table together, that act can heal all of the brokenness and hurt and trauma that we inflict on one another. So, in a world addicted to an enemy-creating machine, we remind ourselves that all that matters is God's table.